Welcome to this episode of Ask the Professor. I'm your host, Ron Tulley, Dean for the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, and Professor of English here at the University of Findlay. Those of you who may have followed us before know that Ask the Professor was started jointly as a sponsored face-to-face event between the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences and 50 North, the wonderful senior center here in Findlay that offers a plethora of programming for the Hancock County community. The purpose was originally to have our professors present on a specific topic that they know well, followed by an open Q&A. In this more intimate format, we'll get to know our professors a bit better, learn about their vocational passions, what they love to teach, their ongoing research, service, scholarship, and hopefully when we're finished, we'll have a better understanding of who they are, their discipline, typical workday, and all that good stuff. So for today's episode, we feature Dr. Kit Medjesky. Kit is a scholar and teacher of rhetoric and media with emphasis on film, humor, and professional wrestling. He currently serves in many positions at UF, including assistant professor of communication, director of the Master of Arts in Professional Communication, and the director for basic speech course programs. In addition to speech and professional communication, Kit regularly teaches courses in media studies and critical research methods. He earned his PhD in communication studies from Bowling Green State University, his Master of Arts in Communication from Indiana State University, and his Bachelor of Science in Physics and Mathematics from Westminster College. Kit currently lives with his family in Perrysburg. That's right, Perrysburg?
That's right.
All right, so welcome, Kit.
Thank you.
So that last part there of your bio, that begs a good opening question. You started your college career off in physics and mathematics. So tell us about that. Were you planning on teaching or continuing on in those fields? What was behind the switch?
Well, yeah, my wife is a high school teacher. She teaches math for Springfield local schools, the one up near Toledo, not the one near Dayton, but the one up near Toledo. And when I started school, I had a really good physics teacher. I really enjoyed that. I thought that maybe that was what I wanted to do. And so I thought, well, if I could teach both math and physics, I'll double major both, because in Pennsylvania, it's a little different in Pennsylvania than is in Ohio. In Ohio, you major in education and you essentially minor in whatever you're going to teach. But in Pennsylvania, at least at the time, you majored in whatever you were going to teach and you minored in education. So I thought I'd teach math and physics. There's a lot of overlap, so it wasn't like two completely different degrees. And started dating my wife when we were juniors, but we had been friends before that. And I had taken a lot of the major courses, but not a lot of the education courses. And about the same time that she started taking some of these education courses, I realized I don't want to do a lot of the things that she'd have to do, including get up regularly at 5 o'clock in the morning. So I quickly realized that I wanted to teach, but teaching high school wouldn't necessarily be the path for me. And at the same time, my roommate was the lead in a musical called Crazy for You. And they needed some help backstage. And I'd always been interested in theater. I watched movies for fun all the time. So I wanted to give it a shot. I was happy to help him. And so backstage, I met one of the actors. His name was Tom Oyer, and Tom and I started chatting. And I realized Tom loved these movies just as much, if not more than me. And we were talking about, wouldn't it be neat to be able to study film? He was a sociology major. And in our conversations throughout as we prepared for the musical, we found out that the next theatrical performance is going to be a play called Detective Story. Westminster College, the real Westminster College, which is in New Wilmington, Pennsylvania. There are 3 in this country for some reason. But I claim that we're the real Westminster College, which also our philosophy professor, Matt Stolik, graduated from as well. But I digress a little bit there. Detective Story had 28 male characters in a school that was 7-2 female to male. So they really needed male actors. I agreed to do it. I got the second lead in it. And while this is happening, Tom and I discovered that the English faculty want to create a film studies minor. all of this, then I discovered I'm essentially done with my math and physics degrees. I don't want to teach anymore. I say I'm going to stay a 5th year. I'm going to pursue theater, and I'm going to help them start this film studies minor. So Tom and I did that, and I was really bitten by both. I decided to go to Indiana State University for my graduate degree because that particular master's program allowed me to take a good chunk of my 2 years of coursework in theater. And Tom actually would go on to move to California. He's an awards director for the Academy Awards. So I got to go a couple of years ago. But that's how I essentially ended up from math and physics to communication. With all due respect to the English department, I could have studied film and English or communication. I went with communication because somebody pulled me aside and said there are fewer communication professors than there are English professors, so you might have an easier time getting a job. So I went that route, and I decided to do communications to theater at the PhD level. I almost did theater as well. And that's how I ended up here, studying from physics and math. But I will say, to the point of what this is, none of that would have been possible without the fact that Westminster College, much like UF, is a liberal arts college. All of those things that I did with math and physics were in no way wasted. They taught me how to adapt. They taught me how to think critically. The rounded curriculum that was offered there, which is very similar to the curriculum that we offer here at UF, positioned me to go from physics and math to PhD in communication seamlessly. Positioned my friend Tom to go from sociology major to Academy Awards director. And there was another film studies minor, her name was Kelly Lake. She came just slightly afterwards. I believe she was an English major, and she works for Illumination Entertainment. And those are the ones that make Despicable Me and things like that. And she's a script supervisor there currently. And again, none of that would have been possible without the kind of education we offer here at UF, which is why I never had my sights set on teaching at a state school, like a big state school. It was always a small liberal arts school where you really get to know the students and get to encourage that kind of education because it meant so much to me. I simply wouldn't be here if I had gone to a bigger school.
Okay. So your PhD is in communication studies, but you do when we talked about that in the bio and certainly in discussions I've had with you before, you'd probably label yourself as a rhetorician as well. So how would you define rhetoric for our audience? And from one rhetoric geek to another, how would you kind of nuance out the differences between rhetoric and communication and rhetoric and English?
That is the hardest question that we're ever at. It's as hard as asking to define what communication is as a discipline, I think. And rhetoric is interesting because both, as you said, English and communication lay claim to it. And there's a long history of, dating back to essentially Plato, where it was an oral tradition. And so communication is sort of taken upon the oral tradition. And so we lay claim to rhetoric that way in many ways, whereas with English, as it moved to a written tradition, began to lay claim to both that portion of the liberal arts as well as rhetoric. And then in the early 1900s, there's this split between, I forget what the English section was called, but essentially a bunch of speech teachers quit an English organization and formed what was then the Speech Communication Association and now the National Communication Association. But that's some history. The actual definition of rhetoric, the simplest way, the overly simplistic way, is to talk about rhetoric as persuasion. Now, I don't feel that rhetoric is fundamentally just persuasion, because rhetoric implies certain things. It implies, to me at least, a public that is being spoken to and addressed. It implies that there is something that comes before persuasion, which is a relationship with the audience, primarily through some form of identification. That becomes, most of my rhetoric background stems from Kenneth Burke. Kenneth Burke was a scholar who actually never even got an undergraduate degree, but is probably one of the most cited rhetoricians of the 20th century. Really sort of a wild guy that hung out with all the Andy Warhol types and stuff in New York. But his work really did emphasize the idea that before we can persuade, we have to create some sort of identification with an audience. So for me, I think rhetoric is about creating an identification with an audience in an attempt to convey some messages that are typically persuasive, but not always. I know that's not the clearest dictionary definition, but it's a hard thing to pin down in terms of a dictionary definition. As far as the differences between English and communication, what I tend to notice is that there are much fewer differences than what we think. We tend to treat them very differently. There's not a lot of overlap in the scholarship. And if you do dig into the online databases, you'll see that somebody who's an English rhetorician and somebody who's a communication rhetorician have essentially had two similar research agendas, and they don't really overlap all that much. And that's quite unfortunate because we don't build on one another that often. I would say the biggest difference is the kind of scholarship that we typically tend to pull from, the experts. What is being talked about is very similar often. It's just who we're referencing is usually the most different thing. And then like here at UF, there is this rhetoric and writing program. And of course, writing becomes really an important part of the English side of rhetoric, whereas communication, at the beginning, at least with rhetoric, really focused on both speech communication and mediated communication. Although I will say that, is, in my opinion, at least, English recognized that digital modalities and digital rhetorics were going to be where to study in the future, and they have at least caught up to, if not surpassed, communication rhetoric that way. Communication rhetoric does tend to fall quite heavily in politics. There's plenty of digital stuff, don't get me wrong, and it wasn't a fad necessarily, but it certainly is not quite. The English has just, in my opinion, really come a lot further in a shorter amount of time in that aspect. Now I could be wrong because I'm sort of looking on the outside looking in, but when I talk to the colleagues here, I see the work that they're doing. I mean, one of your main rhetoric conferences in English is Computers and Writing, is that right?
Yes.
And, so I mean, it's built into the name of the actual major conference. And we hosted that a couple of years ago, right here.
Yes.
So, it's sort of built into it. So I think that's another major difference. Dr. Harley Ferris and I co-taught a course in the rhetoric of film here a couple of years ago. And we were so intrigued by this question, actually, that some of the students from that class and I presented at the Mid-Atlantic Popular Culture Association a couple of years ago to talk about our experiences in that class and how we sort of found our way into realizing that what looked initially as quite different ended up not being that different at all. It was an interesting conversation, especially once we got done talking. Some of the faculty in the audience, which were mainly English faculty members, were initially confrontational to us about the idea until we really got them to talk and think, like, we're way too territorial about this idea. Even in the conversation about not being territorial, you're being territorial. We could probably get a lot further if we weren't.
So I asked that question, and that's a good point. The silification of academia is real, but to bring it back to more kind of a novice level for our students, when I talk to people about what I do and that word comes up, I either find people looking puzzled at best, and at worst, they sigh because they conflate it often with political rhetoric, but with rhetoric in a broad sense. And I was thinking the other day, this goes back to my sister who's a few years older than me. When she started her undergraduate work at the University of Illinois, they called the speech class rhetoric. That was the name of it. And it used to have this direct tie that was, I think, very plain to most incoming students, that it was speech, that you would persuade orally in front of an audience. And I think that connection has largely been lost in the common sense, in the common vernacular, I should say. But anyway, not to go on, let's switch gears a little bit. Another interest that intrigues me, and I know at least a little about this on the periphery, is your interest in pro wrestling. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how that intersects with your teaching and how it maybe infiltrates some of your courses and places maybe where students wouldn't expect it.
Yeah, so the professional wrestling ends up being pretty an interesting connection, because here is a major portion of culture that a large chunk of the population is ashamed to admit they engage in. And one of the things that we had difficulty with as a research community of professional wrestling, and it is a very interdisciplinary, international research community, was legitimizing the study of it. But when we finally got together and said, we're going to do this, we realized that our students watched professional wrestling. And whenever you legitimized it in terms of being the professor and saying, this is something worth talking about, then suddenly they were much more confident in talking about it and bringing in their experience. And so, of course, some of them have very minimal knowledge. They know who The Rock is, or maybe they know who Dwayne Johnson is, and they know that he was at one point The Rock. But many of them regularly engage with it. Some of them find it very interesting, even watching international wrestling matches, and that's growing increasingly popular in the United States. In fact, one of the students in my media effects class, which is essentially a media criticism class here, she was really contemplating doing her final project on professional wrestling, and I really was trying to get her to do it. And in doing that, I actually delivered a talk that I gave at the Midwest Popular Culture Association here a couple of weeks ago. I delivered it to my class to give them an example of one of the options they might do for presenting their final project. The final project of that class, they can write a paper, they can do a formal conference-like presentation, they can make a video. I was giving them an example of what a conference presentation would look like. And they were really engaged with it as I spoke to them, and it connected to them. Now, every once in a while, you'll run into a class where they aren't particularly interested, or they're not willing to admit that they ever engaged in. But that's no different than running into a class that didn't engage with basketball or NASCAR or anything like that. But the pro wrestling offers an opportunity to really talk about something that is ignored, because when I talk about that, then they probably have things that they, even if it's not wrestling, there's probably something that they like that maybe they feel they don't share with other people, that maybe they feel quite alone in enjoying that particular cultural element. And even if nobody speaks to pro wrestling, it might actually make them think about something else that they do speak to, and they feel a lot more comfortable sharing that. And of course, as I said, there's a stigma still about liking professional wrestling. So when I admit that, and I don't really, to be honest, watch it all that much anymore because the quality is diminished so much. But when I admit to what I enjoy, and that I have enjoyed some of those things that may not be mainstream, then it really does help build the community in the classroom too, and offer them opportunities to share the things that maybe they don't think others might be interested in as well. So it proves to be one of many things that I study that helps open up the conversation, particularly in those media classes, particularly in those criticism research methods classes too.
At risk of employing kind of a gender stereotype, I've often heard pro wrestling referred to as soap opera for men. There's some validity, I think, in that characterization, but it is obviously narrowing too. But thanks for that. I want to keep going with that thread then. So, obviously most of our students take COM 110 here, Communication 110, Principles of Speech. And it's something you have a deep interest in making a quality experience and a lasting education for our students at UF. So tell us a bit about your approach to that course. And also maybe you could talk about your role as the director of the speech programs and how that works in terms of getting symmetry perhaps across the different sections?
Yes. So speech to me is, I mean, it's the basic communication course, which has its strengths and weakness. The weakness being communication apprehension is one of the things people fear the most in this world. And whenever you present communication as a discipline to the body of college students, then they oftentimes associate that fear with the discipline itself and the idea that speech is all we do. So for a lot of students, they think communication is just 4 years of giving speeches. And so that's part of the weakness of starting with what we call the principles of speech course here, but essentially whatever the basic speech course would be. The strength, though, is that communication, particularly oral communication, is an important part of everyone's career, no matter what their career is going to be. Now, that might not be standing up and giving speeches, but if this pandemic has done anything, it's made us realize just how much that is applicable. To the point that just yesterday, I was on a special panel for DePauw University as an invited speaker to talk about how to teach speech online in the pandemic. And one of the questions was, what's going to happen next after the pandemic to this course? And I think one of the things that needs to happen as a discipline of communication is we have to think, okay, maybe we need to add more elements about this kind of public speech. Yeah, sitting in front of a camera, what does that look like? We're not quite there yet as a discipline. We're not quite there yet at UF, but what we do, and one of the things I find really passionate about, is we're constantly evolving this class to make it meaningful for students. This is not a slight to other institutions, but most other institutions require 4 to 5 major speeches. It tends to be something like a process speech, very general informative speech, a general like special occasion speech, and a persuasive speech. But we do require 4 speeches here, but 2 of those 4 are very much tailored to the mission of UF, meaningful lives and productive careers. So the second speech, for example, is what we call the workplace communication speech. And that speech requires our students to go and determine what field they're currently pursuing or maybe interested in pursuing, find people in that field and interview them about communication challenges that they're going to actually have to engage with in their actual workplace. And then be able to articulate not only what those challenges are, but potential solutions to those challenges, which, given the fact that many times our students are in similar fields like animal sciences, it offers an opportunity for that speech to be very meaningful to that component of the meaningful lives and productive careers. The third speech is what we call the media literacy speech. And in that speech, students are asked to analyze the information that they're given every day. So they're tasked with taking a news story, something that's happened in current events, and analyzing a news story version of it and an opinion story version of it, and comparing what is happening in the news story and the information and persuasive appeals, credibility, and things like that, to what's happening in the opinion story, so they can be more media literate. All right, it's a fact-checking the news kind of exercise here that, again, speaks directly to their lived lives and what they're going to have to do every day. And we found that students, those 2 speeches are relatively new, but we're finding students are actually finding that it does make their lives meaningful. The students here don't actually see it, but COM 110, the Principles of Speech course, is part of the core classes, core plus classes we have here. And one of the questions that students answer when they submit their artifact for that assessment is, how much does this course mean to your career or your life? And our hope is that these efforts will make that much more meaningful to them. Because, as I said, with my own experience, this class, if we can make them understand what their industry is going to be like, or what the media that they're going to consume is going to be like, then they will be able to have more meaningful lives and productive careers.
Let's continue with that thought, because I think that's also a good segue into the reality of COVID-19 in this past year. So you've you already were teaching some of your sections online, but you had to move all of them pretty much online. And here we are at the end of, or I shouldn't say the end of November, at the end of the semester, fall semester, we're back in that boat again where everything is done remote. How does that change not just how you approach the course perhaps, but how the students interact, how they feel about their agency in that environment? Just tell us a little about that.
Well, we've learned a lot between how spring ended and how fall has gone. Students, I think, have learned a lot too. And so that helps in the sense that many of them are willing to remember to do things like check their email regularly, or they've bothered to find how to find feedback and announcements on Canvas. That has helped make this transition a little bit easier and better, at least this time around compared to spring. There's a lot less of explaining, what buttons to click kind of a thing. So that certainly helps. But students are definitely still needing a lot of support. I mean, we could get into all kinds of conversations about equity, turning on cameras, availability of internet connections, all sorts of things that are important conversations to have. But in terms of teaching public speaking specifically, we prepared for this because we knew that these last 2 weeks and the finals week were going to require us to be online, which meant we knew that the final speech was going to be recorded for everyone in the class online. So we started the semester with test speeches to make certain that they knew how to record the speech, how to upload a speech, very simple, like 5-second, here's my name kind of a thing. But just to make certain the audio quality was good and the video quality was good, they knew how to do it. And then we practiced online. Many sections did discussion board things that required them to do speeches online. For example, in some of my classes, one of the activities that they do is they do a story. And so the original poster of the discussion board would start a story, and they do a little story time, and they'd get right to the climax of the story and they'd stop. And the replies were for the other people in the class to sort of guess how the story ended, to finish the story in an interesting and compelling manner, in a way that was entertaining, used various persuasive appeals in there, and again, to continue to practice with that. I found, based on spring's experiences, that really building community and maintaining community was really difficult online if you didn't do that online from the beginning. In my classes in the spring, of course, it was no problem because we had been doing that. But when my TAs, for example, had to move, when some of the other faculty members had to move online, it felt like everybody was on their own little island, and they were getting their homework and their feedback through messages in a bottle that maybe did or did not float upon the shores. So I really pushed for my faculty who teach this class to maintain the space face-to-face and build the community there, but build that community online as well. And as I mentioned yesterday, I just had that meeting or that presentation at DePauw University, and one of the other presenters talked about how she created sort of groups, I forget what she called them, but essentially little family groups within the class that allowed them to build that community on a smaller scale as well. And I think that was a good idea. I'm going to encourage my TAs and my faculty to consider that option for the spring as we face another potential shift, at least at the beginning. Our first week will be online, and we may see it again. We don't know how the virus is going to play out. So that's a good idea, I think, that I pulled away from that yesterday. This idea of building smaller communities within our larger community. But I can't stress enough, good online teaching, just like good face-to-face teaching, is about building a community of people who trust they have a safe environment. And a safe, supportive culture with a community is how you do teaching well. It's certainly how you do online teaching well, and it's absolutely necessary for the speech class, because as I mentioned at the beginning of this, that communication apprehension is so strong. If they don't feel safe with the people they're sharing this content with, they're not going to have the confidence to do it well.
Yeah, we could definitely have a whole separate episode on online teaching. It's a passion of mine. As you know, I've done it for years. You and I are both involved with QM on a pretty deep level. So yeah, I'll hold that off for a second discussion, a second interview. You gave us a nice narrative earlier on how your undergraduate experience at Westminster, which you likened to UF in some ways, brought you in kind of a circuitous way to an interest in film, which you've developed kind of a scholarly interest in that. That's a huge area. So what specifically are you interested in film? And again, maybe for the students, how do you integrate this into your courses?
Well, it's funny, scholarship-wise, most of my publications and presentations have been on documentary film. I will say that my absolute least interesting, the form of film that I'm absolutely least interested in is documentary film. So I don't know how that has happened, but it just seems to have been the case. But the film studies that we tend to do, I take that approach depending on what the class is. So the Rhetoric of Film class, for example, which was a class in the MARW here, much more of a graduate level course. We're reading scholarly articles. We're talking about some complex theory as they relate to, in that class, we focused on some mainstream movies. Come to discover that people don't watch mainstream movies all that much. It was probably 6 years ago, I was teaching an introduction to film class. In that class, I break it down based on what we call language systems. So photography, mise-en-scène, editing, movement, sound, acting, things like that. And so when I was going over the syllabus, I said, you know, we're going to watch Star Wars, but we're going to focus solely on the sound here. And so don't groan when we have to watch Star Wars again. And I looked out into the crowd and I realized based on the looks on their faces that none of them had ever seen Star Wars. None of them. And even with the MARW class, most of them had never seen Back to the Future. Most of them had never seen Jaws. These were adults. We're not talking about 18-year-olds who were, you know, would have been -12 when Back to the Future came out. These were people who were teenagers when Back to the Future came out. Children when Jaws came out. You most certainly would have think they would have seen these movies, but they haven't. So I've come to discover it's fairly, before I tried to avoid newer films because I was worried about them essentially not rewatching the movie for our purposes. But instead, I don't have that fear anymore because I can pick a movie that just came out and they will not have seen it. Some good examples of that would be the media effects class. I'm teaching that right now. And because we were uncertain how COVID was going to happen, normally I pick a variety of types of media for that class. But I chose to really focus on films this semester because I felt that was more stable to rely upon should we be moved online. It would be very easy for me to purchase a digital copy of a movie and make that available to the library or make it available to the students. Whereas it might be a little bit more difficult to ask every student to 1 week subscribe to this service and or download this song. I just wanted to make it easy on the students and make it easy on everybody. So we stuck with film. And this semester, they have done some outstanding presentations. We had a wonderful conversation about representation of race in Remember the Titans. They did an outstanding job talking about the film Us and how essentially it was a narrative about class and particularly Black Americans' need to get out, which, of course, that's Jordan Peele's other movie is Get Out, but they made a great argument about how this movie was more about how Black Americans need to just get out of America and actually deal with the problems that are here. They did a presentation on a documentary, again, called The Social Dilemma that was really popular this semester and talked about how the film did a great job, of presenting the problems of social media, but did so in a way that removed the responsibility of those problems from those who were responsible for creating them in the first place. And while they didn't get into the language of it because it's a little too advanced for an undergraduate class, rhetorically here we have this idea of apologia, which is a speech of self-defense, and they did a great job of talking about this movie, The Social Dilemma, as apologia, in which they were able to, they being the people who made all these social media technologies, were able to put the blame off of themselves and onto essentially this sort of fictional ghost in the machine. So I thought it was really, and what was most fascinating about it was, and this is why our students, they give their presentations and they sound like they have no confidence in what they say. And then I'll summarize exactly what they say and they'll look at me and they'll be like, oh my gosh, I did say something. I said something really interesting. And to see the confidence on their face once I summarize what they just delivered, that project that they just worked on, is just so neat to see how excited and interested they are in their own work. The last one of those, they did another one, a good documentary called Fantastic Lies, which was in ESPN's 30 for 30 on the Duke lacrosse scandal. But the last one they did was on the movie Parasite. I broke them apart into 3 different groups. And one group took a look at how representations of motherhood, how the film used motherhood in order to sort of reproduce some oppressive structures for women. Another one took a look at the class structure that was happening in Parasite and sort of argued that the class structure separates us from actually recognizing the flaws in humanity. And the last one did a great job of actually putting the whole semester together, and they talked about how both Parasite and Us used the similar sort of sewer-based metaphor to talk about the lower class attempting to fight back against the system of power, but how those system of power either essentially flushed them back down or mowed them back down militarily. And 3 different presentations on the same film, and I was just so impressed, so proud of them. I get so proud watching those students who, with the media effects class, what's interesting is those students, it's part of our Core Plus curriculum, but it doesn't have any prerequisites. So I get students across every discipline. It's not just community, it's actually very rarely communication students. I get a ton of marketing students, business students, science students. Many of them walk into the class just thinking media is their pure enjoyment. And then to see them at the end of the 14th, 15th, 16th week recognize, oh my goodness, just how one, smart they are, but just how powerful the media is into perpetuating, shaping messages, shaping culture and things like that. It's really quite exciting. I've had several of the students in that class go on to present their work at the Symposium for Scholarship and Change here at UF. One of the students who wrote a paper a couple years ago on the film is Blue is the Warmest Color, which she made a great argument about comparing the graphic novel to the film version, and how the film version essentially strips the idea of communication from a lesbian relationship. She's working with me on getting that published now and presenting it at a conference. So it's really exciting to see what, and she wasn't a communication, she was a graphic design major. So it's really exciting to see what our students can do whenever they're tasked with looking at the media in a critical way. I'm sure the English department in their criticism classes sees that happen. I'm sure they get quite as excited as I do to see that, because our students, they don't feel that, and it's not our students, but students in general, they typically don't feel very confident about their ability to do this. But boy, it's like watching your child throw a touchdown, or whatever. It's just so, I take such pride in their successes there. It means a lot to me.
Yeah, this is me interviewing you here. Otherwise, I would definitely talk about my graduate class in digital media, because we do talk about a lot of those things. One thing I think is a potential point of intersection for us in the future, maybe even coming into your class and having a talk about this, is I call this age the age of consent and surveillance, because there's 2 components really that I don't think most students think about. On the first end, like things like Facebook, Twitter, and that, there are all these massive consent documents that most people aren't even aware of what they give access to these third-party vendors. In that process, they also conflate these formats with something neutral like the town square or a piece of paper, when it's not. It's this corporate enterprise that has a vested interest in using your information for their own benefit, whether that's profit or for other more nefarious things. But also the surveillance mode that students are completely unaware of, which is that programs like what Facebook uses with its algorithms drop what they literally call not pixels, not like pixels in a picture, but pixels meaning almost bots that go to any site you look at, whether or not you actually have Facebook up on your screen. So it monitors everything you do. We already knew Amazon did that. That's why you get those pop-up ads that reflect your last search. But Facebook does it too, and it does it in a much more insidious way. So anyway, that's me going off.
No, that's a good example, because in that media fix class, one of the first questions I ask is, how many of you are getting wedding advertisements on your social media? And many of them say no. And I say, let me know when you start getting them. You're probably going to get them by the end of the semester. And by the end of the semester, they usually do. And if I ever have somebody who already is getting the wedding advertisements, then by the end of the semester, they usually get the baby advertisements too. Because, you know, those bots don't just search what you're doing. They search what your friends are doing. So even one of the things that I found, one of the better conversations we had was on that social dilemma this semester, because I challenged the students to take criticism a step further and offer solutions to make the world better. Without getting too much into it, rhetorical criticism, media criticism, cultural criticism has a tendency to focus on power structures. I mean, that's what it does. And so most of it is challenging to power structures. It's analyzing how the media, how part of culture, or text, whatever it may be, is contributing to the reproduction of power structures. So as my students typically say, it's negative. I encourage them to, instead of ending there, to offer up a solution to improve the situation. And for that social dilemma, they were like, well, we'll just try to trick the algorithm. Like, we'll go to some random websites so that they won't know what I'm really interested in. And I'm like, oh, the problem is, it's not you. You can't do that. You alone is meaningless. It has to be everybody. You got to get everybody you're networked with to do that, and you'll never be able to do that. You cannot escape those bots, as you pointed out, and that's a hard pill to swallow. I don't want to move too far along, because you mentioned, you said you don't want to deal in your digital media class, your graduate digital media class. It's worth noting to the people that might be listening to this that I was a professor at another university, and I brought some students from that university to look at the MA or W program here. And we sat in on Dr. Tulley's digital media class, and it was so good that I switched jobs to come work for it. So I will say that it's that good of a class. I would recommend that you do it, because I knew, seeing what you all were doing in that class, that I wanted to be a part of something.
That's high praise. I'll quote a famous film, right? One of the most famous lines. It looks like it's the beginning of a beautiful friendship. It certainly was, and we both have reaped good benefits from that. Yeah, I was thinking one thing to close on too, because you had mentioned about the idea of power, and I think that goes back to the beginning of our conversation about rhetoric, and that's important too for students, I think, to understand that scholars have been talking about postmodern rhetoric for years. The fundamental difference, I think, between when I was an undergrad, and I'll date myself, I just turned 50. When I was an undergrad and we began to study rhetoric, we were really rooted in the moderns. And the moderns did not view a call to activism in the way postmoderns do, because truth is always power with postmoderns. It's always about who has the power and who can gain the power. And that's a fundamental difference. So I love the fact that when you're teaching something, it moves from what, and this is probably an unfair characterization, but I'll say it, moderns had a very much of an academic approach to the world. It was much more theoretical. This is about praxis. And the fact that you're getting your students to think, how can I make a difference in this world? How can I take what I know and put it into action? I think that's the fundamental mission of what we do, but more importantly, the mission of life. You know, what small role do I have to play in changing things? So I'm expounding a bit.
No, well, it's a good point, because I'll tie that back into the public speaking class, actually. There's plenty of ways to persuade, written and orally and digitally, of course, as well, and interpersonally. But for the public speaking persuasive speech, for this, we require them to do what's known as Monroe's motivated sequence. That's really just a speech organizational pattern, but specific to it, it's motivated to act. And this week, for example, this past week, students have been really struggling. They struggle every semester to commit to action. They do become nervous about the idea of asking their fellow citizens, their peers and their friends to do something, even do something as simple as stop drinking pop, or go for a walk every day. They would much rather try to persuade somebody to abolish guns in America than to ask somebody to do something relatively simple like recycle their water bottles. And so I think the more that we can, as people, encourage others to act, will make it more normal to ask people to do things. It isn't that natural of a thing. And I think a lot of the social media, the social dilemma, certainly the argument of that film suggests that a lot of research over the past 20 years, everything from Bowling Alone and things like that, have created this idea of we're all on these islands by ourselves. And I mentioned that earlier with the transition online, but coming with that is a nervousness about asking people to make the world better. There is a reason why a 13-year-old Swedish girl took the world by storm for climate change, because she had the courage to simply ask people to do some things that are very simple. Greta Thunberg's calls to action were simple calls to action, quite obvious calls to action, but she was one of very few people that were willing to speak up about it. And certainly, I mean, there were all kinds of marketable things about her that made her easy to make the face of it. I am not downplaying the activism of so many other people, but the people who speak out and call to act can get things done. They truly can. We saw it after us. There's been too many shootings in schools in America that now my brain is forgetting which one. The one in Florida with those students.
Is that Park View, maybe? Parkland, I think. Parkland High School.
Imagine the tragedy. To date myself, I was a senior when Columbine happened, and it was unheard of. I mean, it was just absolutely unheard of. I watched my study hall teacher cry for days over it, and now we can't even remember the name of the school. And that is just what a horrible thing to think about. I'm glad that it sort of died down, but of course that might just be because of the pandemic. I digress on something, but that's the kind of activism we do need to speak out about, and we do need to encourage our students to act. And I think that that's a great point, because especially I notice I'm a millennial. I'm the oldest millennial, so much so that I consider my wife a Gen Xer, and she's 1 month older than me. But the millennials did a lot of talking, some action, but they called us slacktivists for a reason. These Gen Zers, I feel like are a great, I cry sometimes. There have been times I've listened to the young people in my class and what they're doing, not even just talking about it, but doing. And I'm moved to tears over how active they are in making their world better. And I'm excited to watch them lead. I feel very good about getting old, knowing they'll be the ones taking care of me.
You hope.
Yeah, I do hope. I hope both will lead, and I hope that I'll live that long.
Yeah, the one closing thought I would have on that, and we really have to move things along here and kind of wrap it up with maybe a softball question, but I'm very careful that I don't impart too much of my activism, though. That's what I take from the moderns, because there is a beauty, and I wouldn't even call it the semblance, you know, because postmoderns would challenge that and say, no, it's always a fraud. You're never objective. I think there's sometimes a need in the classroom to be silent, to not let folks truly know which side of the fence you're on until it's appropriate, so that they can formulate their own views instead of trying to please the master. And that's difficult to do, especially in the world we live in now, when it seems like, and this could be, again, a product or a result of the proliferation of social media and media in general, this sense of urgency about everything. Everything seems more urgent. Everything seems more exacerbated. So perhaps, again, that's just my view, you know, as an Xer who did not grow up with this type of media, but inherited it and lives in it. So,
I mean, definitely that sentiment is there, of urgency. You know, people, this was the most important election that ever happened. You know, the world hinges on this, and certainly it was important. But the idea, of course, that, you know, the world hinges on its existence based on the result of the election, for example, is the kind of thing that I think you're getting at there. Your point about sort of not giving your activism is one of the hardest things about teaching that media. I mean, I'm a pretty liberal guy, and I find that to be the hardest struggle, is to sitting back and let the students find their own argument when we do that media effects or any sort of other media or cultural criticism class, to let them find their own argument, because they come up with so many good ideas. I want to take one and run with it. And it is hard to sit back, but when I do, it's their argument and it's meaningful to them, and it's their activism, their argument. And then it's really nice to sit back and follow. You know, people downplay being a follower. I'm very much happy to be a follower with some pretty awesome arguments and pretty awesome actions that they put out in front of me.
So we'll close with this question. You may have heard this before. A mutual colleague of ours and a friend of mine, Damon Osborne, always asks this question in interviews. So I'm going to steal it from him because I think it's a good one. You're walking down a hall and there's a group of students and they're saying some things about you, and they're pretty good things. What are they saying?
Oh, about probably my hair. I don't know, because I don't think that way about myself. Frankly, I could stand to improve my own thoughts about myself. But I guess what I would say is I care. I care about them tremendously. These students, they just mean so much to me. I have, from the day one I started teaching, I've always said and always will say, if you're my student for 1 second, you're my student for life. And I care. I care about your health. I care about your mental health. I care about your success in the classroom. I care that you have food. I care that you succeed. And that's, I know I keep bringing it up, but I always do like the very simple mission of UF, the meaningful lives and productive careers, because that sounds very businessy. I think it does. I think it sounds very businessy, but in it is a notion that everyone here at UF cares, and I love being part of that. I love that my students know that I will give them money to eat. I will drive them home if it's snowy. I will make certain that they have shelter to go to if they can't get anywhere. And I will absolutely make certain that I will do whatever I can to ensure that they succeed in my classes. You know, I will say that not everyone agrees with me, but I am very big on allowing students to fail and retry, or if fail, what I mean, failure to them might be getting an A-, but allowing them to make those efforts and learn for them. It is very time consuming. It takes a tremendous amount of time to grade an assignment 2 or 3 times, to follow up with them 4 or 5 times because they didn't get it right. But this persuasive speech, for example, many of them did offer up belief speeches instead of action speeches. And I have sent out 3 different messages through Canvas that say final update. So obviously I don't really know what the word final means, but I do that because my goal is they should all be able to get the grade they want to get. Yeah. If they want to earn an A, then I'm willing to look at their work and accept resubmissions as much as they need to, up until when final grades are due, to let them get that goal that they have. Because this is many of them, this is going to be their last opportunity to learn. When I have a student go to a PhD program, they're like, well, I could graduate a PhD in 3 years. I'm like, no, take 4. This is your last opportunity to take this coursework. I know, Ron, you've got many, many degrees, and because you're continuing education kind of person, and I would love that as well here at UF. We've got some cool programs, but point being is for many of them, they're not going to continue their education. So I want to make certain they get the most out of that opportunity. And so that's part of the caring about them. I just really do care and want to see them succeed. I care about my colleagues, I care about the students. And so if they were to talk about me, I sure hope it would be first and foremost my hair, and then that I care tremendously about. But definitely the hair.
Yeah. Now, it is a laborious process, no doubt. I always tell my students the best ideas and the best writing come from a recursive process, and that process never stops. And I think folks in other disciplines, and this is not to disparage anybody, but if you're one of those professors that is lucky, or perhaps in my view, maybe unlucky enough to have Scantron-based tests, so to speak, multiple choice, you circumvent a lot of that labor, but you don't have the joy of those ideas coming to fruition and really building on those. And some of, like you said earlier, you're amazed continually with how smart your students are, as well as just watching them evolve, into these young, adults that they are. So I'll close with one question again. You continue down that hall, and here's the part you said you're good at. And there's another group of kids and students, and they're saying things that aren't so nice. And what are they saying?
Probably the shoes. This time it's the shoes. I tend to like wearing flip-flops. I mean, if it's my students, I would say that part of the problem with letting them redo things so much is that it puts a lot of emphasis on the feedback and less emphasis on the grade. So I tend not to assign a grade until they're confident with their work. And so sometimes, students are like, hey, it takes a little bit of time to grade, which isn't exactly true. It does take me some time to grade. It doesn't take me long to get feedback. And that's where the difference is. But if they're going to complain about anything, it's going to be about that number in the Canvas system may be taking a little bit longer. But let me stress to everybody, they're getting the feedback, but they're getting feedback, just not necessarily a grade because I want them to have the grade they're confident with. But I would suspect that would be the thing that but if it's just your average person, again, definitely the shoes. I could buy better shoes. I tend to cheap out on my shoes. I don't know why.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Kit. Thank you all for joining us on this journey with Dr. Medjesky. If you have follow-up questions for him, you can reach him at medjesky@findlay.edu. That's medjesky@findlay.edu. And join us on our next episode, and that person is yet to be named. These come out bi-monthly, so they are available through UFTV, which is very easy to access. You can either go through the Findlay Media Network or through our YouTube channel, which is UFTV on YouTube. Thanks for joining us, folks.